Hello, my name is Akім Галімов. I'm from Kyiv, Ukraine. I'm a journalist by education and I once did journalism. But now I run 1+1 production originals and produce different content, movies, TV series, show, content for YouTube. A separate area of my activity has been documentaries about history for 8 years. Why did I start doing this? Because I'm really annoyed by the injustice. And there is a lot of it if you look at the history of Ukraine and Russia. I myself come from a family of Crimean Tatars. This is a small nation, 200,000 people living in the Crimea. You may have heard, but in 1944, Soviet dictator Stalin blamed the entire nation in treason. He said that the Crimean Tatars helped the Nazi, and in one May night, all the people were deported to Uzbekistan in freight cars. My grandfather was in one of these cars. His name was also Akім, and he was only 12 years old. 40 years later, the Soviet government ruled that this was wrong and unfair. The charge of treason were unfounded, but no one was punished. The Crimean Tatars were allowed to return, but entire generation of people were destroyed. To this day, Russia continues to promote Soviet narrative about the Crimean Tatars in the Crimea, because the Crimean Tatars don't want to submit to the occupation of the Crimea Peninsula. So, a fictional story has ruined the lives of 200,000 people, including my family. We returned to Crimea, to other motherland, only at 1994. My parents had to begin everything from the 0 point, but they did it. The bodybuilding and everything were okay until 2014. Russia came again and occupied Crimea. They justify this by the history, but it was false. My parents had to move to Kyiv region, to Irpin, and again they had to start everything from the beginning in '65. They took small kiosk and opened cafe. By 24th of February, Russia came again to Kyiv region, exactly to my parents' cafes as well. Thanks God they managed to save, but they had to run again, because now Russia says that not only Crimea, but whole Ukraine belongs to Russia by the history. So that's why I'm exploring history, because this is very important, not only for historians, but for ordinary people as my parents. Let's have a look at the cases when Russia uses history as a weapon. This is the coat of arms of the Russian Empire. It's important for any empire to control and keep its territories under surveillance, and most importantly, the nations who live there. And history is becoming the main weapon of autocratic regimes that want to rule. At least Russia has achieved mastery in using this tool. Over the past 300 years, Ukraine has experienced this fully. But let's back to the coat of arms. This is a very clear example of how historical manipulations work. In general, this coat of arms adorns the frame of an ancient icon. I saw it at the National Museum of History of Ukraine. A few years ago, the museum staff took this frame for restoration, began to clean it, and suddenly the coat of arms of the Russian Empire fell off. And another coat of arms was under it, that of Ivan Mazepa. Who was Ivan Mazepa? He was the Ukrainian hetman who ruled Cossack Ukraine for 22 years. It was the end of the 17th century. During this time, Ukraine became a strong state with its own authorities and a powerful economy. Mazepa was a patron of the arts. He gave many gifts to the church, including this icon. That's why its coat of arms is there. During the Northern War with Sweden, the Russian Tsar refused to help Mazepa defend Ukraine, and the hetman formed an alliance with Karl XII. Of course, after this, Mazepa became a traitor for 300 years. Russian Church, to this day, this is not a joke, reads him anathema, that is, curses him. All the portraits of Mazepa were destroyed, all his coats of arms were erased. This policy worked so hard that even the Ukrainians themselves believed that their national hero was a traitor. The fact that the history is a real weapon for Russia proves that it's controlled by the special services. There is such a powerful historical organization in Russia called the Russian Historical Society. It unites all historical institutions, organizations and scientists and forms the historical policy of the entire state. Here is its chairman. Do you know him? Here he is with Putin. This is the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service. Yes, Russia is probably the only country in the world where the head of the organization that forms the historical policy of the country and the head of all spies is one person. It looks strange, doesn't it? But let's get deeper. In the middle of the last century, Once I managed to get into the KGB archive in Kiev. Now the documents there are declassified and they reveal a lot of interesting things. For example, there was a whole secret commission of historians who wrote history textbook for Ukrainians. This commission was controlled by the KGB. Once this commission was even visited by Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's right-hand man, who personally controlled that this secret commission would write about another Kazakh hetman, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who is considered one of the founders of Ukraine in the modern sense. In short, the task has always been the same, to make Ukrainian heroes traitors. Instead of that, to show that Ukrainians have always sought to be together with Russia. Destroy or hide in archives all the facts of the fierce resistance of Ukrainians and hide the history of the struggle of Ukrainians for their independence. But show the whole world that we are one people. For what? In order to secure control over our land. It's very simple. So, when you hear from Russian politicians on TV that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, look at these figures. 5.4 million people, population in Norway. 10 million Ukrainians were killed by the Kremlin from 1918 to 1991. The figure is not final. This is the Holodomor, repression, Gulag, other crimes. I'll tell you a story. In 1654, the Ukrainian hetman signed a treaty with the Moscow Tsar. This was typical for those times, when the Ukrainian Cossacks, not having a full statehood, signed treaties with many rules around them. It was an ordinary military alliance which, however, fell apart after a couple of years. It's important that at that time Muscovites and Ukrainians were completely different people. They have different language, a completely different political tradition and a different culture. During the Soviet times, the Kremlin felt that Ukraine was trying its best to break away from Moscow, and they used the myth of one nation. History continues to be Russia's weapon. Do you remember the historical essay that Putin launched on the eve of a full-scale invasion? The key idea is that Ukraine as a state never existed, that it emerged in 1991 after the collapse of the USSR. But let's look at this manuscript. This is the Kiev Chronicle of 1187, 12th century. Here we are talking about the death of the Kiev prince, and it is written, and the whole Ukraine wept for him. 12th century, the first mention of the name Ukraine. It was the self-name of our lands. Abroad we were known as Rus, but the peoples themselves called this land Kraina, from the word krayati, cut, that is literally my piece of land. Prince Volodymyr baptized Kiev, the main city of Rus, in 988, 10th century. Moscow was founded in 1147, 12th century. Their country was called Moscovia, and only Peter I came up with the idea of calling it Russia, obviously claiming the heritage of Rus. And Putin follows his tradition. Look what a huge monument Putin put up near the Kremlin to Volodymyr, Prince of Kiev. There is only one question. Has Volodymyr ever been to Moscow? Of course not, because Moscow didn't exist then. There are many such examples, and I will tell you honestly, it's difficult for us to fight propaganda. Here are some numbers. 9 million euros were allocated by the EU to counter propaganda from 2018 to 2020. 300 million euros were allocated by Russia for Russia Today in 2022. So we have to make conclusions and systematically do efforts to resist this Russia's informational weapon.